So I don't know about you, but I definitely deal with challenges, setbacks, and all kinds of interesting intricacies of challenges on my way to growing my own business. And I'm sure you're in the same boat. And it's for this reason I am beyond excited to bring on the show Richard Citrin to talk about how you can use all of these setbacks and challenges as catalysts for greater success. So what's cool about Richard is besides being just an amazing human being, he is a business psychologist and he works with organizations and individuals to help them achieve even more than they thought that was possible and to leverage the power of really difficult and challenging situations. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Richard.
Thank you, Betsy. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It is great to be with you. I'm really excited to share some ideas and have this conversation going on between us.
And one of the things that is so important to me on this particular show. Oh, and I forgot to introduce myself on the show. I forgot to even do my opening jingle for crying out loud. So, this is the Enough Already podcast. So, for welcome everybody who's listening in, this is the show for consultants and coaches who want to forge their own paths to success in their careers and their lives. And what I do in my business, I'm Betsy Jordyn. I'm your host, and I help people, turn their careers into their own businesses and figure that out. So, what we're talking about here was this resilience is so important and so near and dear to the heart of my clients because a lot of us don't necessarily come to consulting or coaching business ownership because everything was going really well. So they get here in a different, from all of these different challenging situations, and it actually creates that unique opportunity for them. So, is that what you mean by resilience, or what is your definition for resilience?
Yeah, so most people, resilience has multiple spheres that it operates in. It's an engineering term. It means when a piece of metal returns back to its original shape. It's also an ecological term. We talk about the resilience of the Gulf Coast around Louisiana after hurricanes. And of course, there's a psychological use for the term resilient, which typically means returning to a former state of being psychologically. So if we're stressed and our heart rate goes up, somebody cuts us off, a resilience is typically defined as the time it takes to return to that calmer state where our heart rate goes down, our breathing becomes more normal. That's typically the idea of resilience. Some people will say bounce back. How long does it take you to bounce back? And that's resilience. In my study of resilience, which really has been for the past 20, 30 years probably, I really take a broader view of resilience, Betsy, and I think of resilience as a way to address and deal with the challenges, adversity, and stress that we talk about. I don't talk about managing stress because stress, like time, is time is a physical imperative. You don't manage time. Time manages us. In the same way, you don't manage stress because stress is a biological imperative. So when that person cuts us off, or your boss gives you a short time frame, or your kid comes home from school in tears, our body jumps into motion. We can't keep that from happening. That's just the biological imperative of it. And so I think of resilience as being something that I call going across the resilience continuum, which is how can we deal with our stress more effectively. And so my definition of resilience is our ability to effectively plan for, number one, to navigate gracefully and successfully, number two, and number three, bounce forward from challenging and difficult events in such a way that we learn and grow from them. So kind of
Wow.
these components. Can we plan for stressful situations? You know when they're coming up. Not that this interview is stressful, but I wanted to make sure that it went well. So this morning I took some notes, I did some planning, I checked my Zoom, looked at my background. I did everything to make sure that when I got into the interview with you, everything was as I would want it to be. That reduces the chance of something going wrong, lowers my stress level going into something. I leave for the airport early when I have a plane to catch. I don't leave. I try not to leave at the last minute.
Mm-hmm.
Navigating gracefully, that I always say is the hard part, because when we're in the middle of a stressful situation, we don't really control our body or our response to that stress. However, there are ways to think about it and really to develop some skills in being equanimitous about those situations, being balanced when they occur in real time, so we don't lose our capability to deal with that situation. You know, what would happen if you were you watched a car crash and you saw somebody who was injured? You know, would you freak out, or would you be able to render aid, call police and emergency vehicles, and be able to do that in a way that was helpful? Number three is this idea of bouncing forward, not just bouncing back, which is that traditional way of thinking of resilience. Bouncing forward says, wow, I want to learn from this situation. I want to take this experience and make something better out of it. I want to become a better person. So we think about these challenges and adversities and how can we learn and grow from them. And that, you know, learning and growing is really at the heart of being a good consultant, being a good employee, being a good learner. You want to be able to do that, but it's particularly important for consultants because we're experience so many diverse items in our work with clients that we want to take those learnings and apply them. And our clients are coming to us typically with some issues or concerns that they want to have resolved. How can we learn from those experiences to help them even more?
You know, there's just so much in what you just said. And I feel like what you've done is like take a major elevated reframe on the concept of resilience. I think that the basic information when people talk about like people are resilient, you know, in today's volatile world and all of that, I think it's just a matter of like, okay, I'm going to survive through it. You know, like that's what they think. It's like I'm just going to muddle through. I will survive. I will make it.
Mm.
I'll keep trudging along. And then you're saying the traditional definition from a scientific standpoint is returning back to stasis, you know,
Right.
and the more resilient you are, you could just get back to stasis. And that would be an interesting perspective is like bouncing back, like, you know, and reducing that cycle time between this crisis and stress, get back to normal. I love like even that would be a better perspective than I just, you know, I can survive through these difficult things. I could just get to this stasis. But what you're saying is that there's an opportunity to say, hey, listen, I'm accepting that stress and difficult things are a part of life. And so when that happens, it's not if it happens, it's when it happens. I will A, plan in advance for how to mitigate it. Two, when it happens, make a conscious choice to gracefully, you know, almost like journey with the stressful situations rather than let it consume you. And then the ultimate is, hey, how do I take these difficult situations and like almost like bounce forward? So it's not even like, oh, I'm just going to live down here and this is what I'm just managing. I'm not looking at just this. It's like this is a springboard. This is an opportunity. That's huge. That's completely different than what most people think about in terms of resilience.
Yeah, thank you. You nailed it. And I think the element of this for me, you know, I'm an optimist. I've always been an optimist, and so I like to look for what's working. It's funny. I had a call from a client who asked me to meet with her chief operation officer and their HR person. They're having some trouble hiring for certain positions, and she wants me to meet with her these two key staff members and look at, you know, what some of the issues may be. And included in her note were a list of about 15 reasons why it wasn't working. And what I looked for on that list was one thing about why it was working, and there wasn't anything. So the whole orientation of this effort that they're doing, this initiative, is around why it isn't working. Now, they are able to hire some people. Why? What's the success factors? What is it that draws people to them? Taking that's such a big flip, and really, you know, people ask me, what's the silver bullet of resilience? Is there one thing I can do? I don't know, should I say this now or should I save it for later?
Wait, I can see you're don't leave us hanging. All right, you could save it for later so that it will be interesting enough to keep everybody listening into the end.
Save the silver bullet for later. The important point of the story is that how can we change our thinking around so we see what's possible rather than what the reasons are that's not working. There's so much negativity, and the negativity bias, this tendency we have to see what's not working, what's wrong. It just first of all, it's another biological thing, because if we're walking on the savannah hunting woolly mammoths, we're looking behind us to make sure the saber-toothed tiger isn't hunting us.
Right.
So we need to be aware of challenges. But the truth is, today the saber-toothed tiger isn't hunting us, and we're generally safe in situations. So let's honor and recognize what's not working, and let's look at the positivity side. What is working? That comes out of really the definition of the resilience model for me. The way I talk about the resilience advantage is what I refer to it as.
Is it just like I only see the positive or I see the opportunity? Because I think that there's a difference between I'm just going to have this, that toxic positivity. Like maybe the situation really is bad, but it's like, oh, but they mean well, or I'm going to think positively, or at least I'm, not in some other country where I'm, poor or whatever, rather than like, hey, maybe there's a reason why this is happening to me. Seems to be a different kind of positivity that you could have. Like let's talk about like a typical scenario where I would say at least 80% of the clients that I work with who wind up in a consulting or coaching business ownership opportunity, it came because of job loss, of some kind, some horrible job situation. And you could say, well, this boss is toxic, or this organization, or I got laid off and this is horrible. Or maybe from the resilient advantage standpoint, is say, I wonder if this is something that's done not to me, but for me, and that there's something that's possible that I didn't see, rather than denying. Because I worry about when people talk about the positivity, is that we're going to deny our reality and almost like put ourselves in cognitive dissonance where it's like everyone's like, oh, this is so great. But but this feels really bad to me.
Yeah, no, I hear you, and I would agree that that's where we want to work towards. What I find generally is that if I'm working with an individual who has lost their job, it's very difficult and wants to make or somebody who's in a job and wants to make a career transition. I work with plenty of those folks. It's difficult for them to see where the opportunity is. That's a big leap.
Yeah.
So, I'm not Pollyannish about positivity. However, what I will start to say to someone is, let's talk about what your strengths are.
Mm-hmm.
So you've lost your job, or or you hate your job, even worse. Losing your job, that's a blessing. Somebody saw that it wasn't a good fit for you, uh, and you're feeling bad. To say where's the opportunity, I think we definitely want to get there. However, generally the person's feeling so bad about themselves or negative that I want to start by assessing. For me, it's always coming back to strengths. What is it that you do well? What is it that you enjoy doing? Where do you see your capability, capacity? Because I'm wanting to help build that person up incrementally. If I jump to opportunity, that may be the case. However, they may not be ready
Right.
to that because they just don't see where the opportunity is for themselves because they're in a funky place. They're in some confusion, uncertainty, confidence, maybe wounded. And it's the same thing when I think consultants and coaches get called into business situations, even where a coaching assignment can be development based as opposed to performance based. So somebody is having to assume a new role, is being coached into a bigger position. They may not feel confident about all of their skills, or they shouldn't feel confident about all their skills. I want to start to help them see where those capacities are. Then we can move on to something else. So I think kind of in an incremental, but you're absolutely right. We want to be transitioning that, not be Pollyannish about positivity.
And maybe there's something about this, like traveling gracefully with stress. One of the things that I notice when I work with a lot of consultants and coaches who are starting a business, like they've never been a business owner. Even if you know how to advise businesses, you don't know how to run your own business. So there's all these myths and stories that we have that I think creates that suffering, where it's like, oh, I should already know how to do this, and we have all of that. And I think where it's like that traveling gracefully is it's so like so what? You don't have the skill sets yet. If you're going for a promotion, if you are a director and now you're going to a VP, don't like feel bad that you don't have the skill sets. Be excited that you don't have the skill sets because you're going into a new level. We shouldn't be we shouldn't know how to do things when we are making changes, but we have these myths and stories, so we judge ourselves rather than just, as you were saying, like before that, like I think that would be a great application of the traveling gracefully.
Absolutely. When we wrote about this in my book with my colleague Mike Couch, Strategy Driven Leadership, we talk about how and why people get promoted. And we always say that if somebody is 100% ready for the next job, that is, they're totally ready, don't put them in that because you're wasting resource. There's nothing for them to learn. They already know how to do it. If they're 75% ready, that's ideal because
Hmm.
that's the person who doesn't have it all together, but they have a good foundation. And if they're 50% ready, they probably can do the job, but they're going to need some support, some coaching, some training. And you're absolutely right. It's around the skills and competencies associated with doing that job that most people lack because they just haven't done it. And that's where I think I love talking about opportunity. How exciting is this for you to learn something new? It's
Yeah.
a challenge.
Yeah.
That's
Like I'm in Denver right now and I'm new here and like one of the things I want to do is start, hiking more and climbing more. Like I've never done it before, and I could sit here and judge myself over and over again, but the fact is I've never done it before. How am I supposed to know? How am I supposed to know what equipment I need and what do I need to do? Like I don't know. I'm not gonna know.
my wife and I went do a good deal of hiking, and about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, we decided to get hiking sticks because some of the trails we were using were rocky and hilly and wet, and we had been using them for about 6 or 9 months, and then we went hiking with an experienced trail guide. And he pointed out to me that I wasn't holding the sticks properly, and that if I changed my hand grip and used them in a different way of walking, they would be more efficient and effective for me. So I didn't know. I guess I probably should have gone to YouTube and asked the question, but I figured, all right, pretty easy using hiking sticks, but there's an art to that as well.
Yeah. And it's good to rely on somebody else. Like that might be part of the resilience advantage is knowing when I need help to get that help and not feel bad.
No, I think today one of the things that we're seeing more and more is the importance of community and how much we get from community and having community be intentional. So, if you're in a consulting situation, get yourself into a mastermind group. Reach out, you reach out to you, Betsy, and have people work with you, or I don't know if you're doing any groups,
I do. I have an
but
amazing group.
yeah, have that so you can have that kind of support. Early in my career, I was a clinical psychologist, and I found it was important to meet with other clinicians to talk about cases, to process what was happening with clients, to talk about how to run the business, and really for my own self-care. Those are challenging situations, and you and I have both been in a consulting community, and we know the value of having that support from others and getting feedback from somebody who's been there already.
It was interesting. I had a client who is really struggling. We're working on her branding right now, and she was just really in a hard place one-on-one and just emotionally because there was a lot of imposter syndrome and all kinds of other things that came up. But later on that afternoon, we had my community meeting. And so she had an opportunity to share how she was feeling with the community. And then she had somebody else who's in the same boat she is, like raise her hand and she's like, I'm in the exact same boat. And then another person said, I'm in an exact same boat. So having me as a mentor wasn't enough, but having other people like just raise their hand and say, I'm there too. She completely transformed. She sent me an email later. She's like, all of that Eeyoreness has disappeared because I got that kind of support. So I think that there's a huge aspect of having the community surround you. I do want to go back to because you mentioned like your psychology background. I am curious how you went from a psychologist to becoming the consultant and coach that you became, author, speaker, and all those other things, and an expert. Like, how did you become this expert in resilience? Was it through your work? Was it through your personal life? Can you kind of bring the thread and how resilience has become like, really your thought leadership?
Yeah, it really has. Thank you. Actually, it started very early in my career when I was a psychology intern and worked at a community mental health center. and we had we had I was in the education group, and so we actually went out to companies and spoke to them about mental health issues, and stress was one of them. And we actually, it was the early days of Saturday Night Live, and we consider ourselves the Saturday Night Live group of the Community Mental Health Center. And so we would go and kind of entertain and talk to people about, in those days, I was talking stress management. So it's always been that thread that's been through my life. But there were couple of major incidents that happened for me, both personally and professionally. On the professional side, we were living in Dallas, Fort Worth on 9/11. And on Tuesday, September 11th, about 7:30 at night, I got a call from American Airlines, who is headquartered at the DFW airport in Dallas, Fort Worth. And they asked us if we could come down to their customer call center and do some stress debriefing with their customer reps who had been on the phone all day talking. American lost two planes that day, of course, talking to family members and crew and everyone else. And so over the next really 6 months, we spent a lot of time at American Airlines in the terminal, at the training center with flight attendants, pilots, ramp agents, ticket agents, everyone, really helping them to just kind of gain some understanding. And the story I share in the book is about a flight attendant about 3 weeks after, just after flying resumed again, who had a flight that morning to Paris, and she was in the corner of a terminal area. There was nobody in the terminal. She was in tears, and I went and sat down and introduced myself, and we had this, amazing conversation where I mostly listened the same way your colleagues did in your group meeting, mostly listened and shared some ideas. And after about, 60 minutes of talking, she looked me in the eye and she said, I have to go on this flight. I have to do that for myself, for my colleagues, for my company, and for our country. So with that, she kind of stood up and gave me a hug, and off she went to Paris. And I was just so struck by how she dealt with that, processed it, understood that, and that I saw as her way of being resilient, bouncing forward, not just bouncing back. Bouncing back would have been, I got to do this flight. I'm going to suck it up and do it. That's bouncing back, barely. She went much further than that. She really transformed herself and did all of those elements, particularly the navigation and the bouncing forward. In my personal life, so that was 2001, and during that time we had some tragedies in our family. In 1997, our son had contracted AIDS in 1994, and then he was just a little too early for the early cocktails that had been designed, and he passed in 1997, which was obviously very, very tragic and very difficult for our family. Ken was very courageous, and we were, loved him and proud of him all the time, and had an amazing support system of friends and loved ones who were there for him. And so I was inspired by Ken. In fact, in 1999, I did a bike ride in Ken's memory, an AIDS bike ride across Texas in the Texas heat from Austin to Houston and Dallas, and had to raise about $3,000 in order to do this ride. It was this fundraiser for AIDS. And between my friends and network and clients and family, I raised over $25,000.
Wow.
So a wonderful way to kind of manifest that. Tragically, however, 5 years later, after Ken passed in 2002, our daughter Corinne, who had 3 small children, was diagnosed with an aggressive form of breast cancer. Corinne was a physical therapist. She took great care of herself. She was a knowledgeable healthcare professional, and it was just missed. She even went to an oncologist who said, there's no history of breast cancer in your family. This can't be breast cancer, but it was. And we lost Corinne 2 years later after bone marrow transplant. And that was, that on top of Ken was just so difficult to bear and to handle. And Sheila, my wife, stopped working, and we took Corinne down to MD Anderson. She had lived in Nebraska at the time, and she got bone marrow transplants, and everyone did everything we could. She had an amazing network of friends. She lived in Lincoln, Nebraska at the time. Her friends, of course, made meals every night, and they took the kids to school, and And in fact, uh, the other day, today's March, what is today, March 7th? March 5th was her birthday. And her son always posts on Facebook a memorial for Corrine. And there must have been 60 comments from people about how much Corrine meant to them and how
Mm.
she changed them. So she was, just an amazing woman of faith and a woman of character. And so I think for me, the element of resilience was how do my wife and I handle this situation after it's happened, and we were very intentional about it. There's a bit of a myth about couples that break up after loss of a child, and the myth is that most couples do, but we did some research, and actually the number is relatively low, only about 15, 16% of couples will separate, but that doesn't mean that it's not an estrangement or a difficult way of handling it. And Sheila and I recognized we needed to be intentional about doing it. We made some changes. I left the clinical world and went into the corporate world. I needed something a little more stable. I didn't want to have to deal with, the individual issues that can get very intense in a clinical practice. And I was interested in the corporate side of healthcare. So I got involved in that for a dozen or so years. And during that time, Sheila and I kind of went down parallel paths. She gave up her career as a professor and social worker and became an author and extended her work as an artist
Mm.
to do groups. And she's a dancer, professional dancer originally. Now she's become an author and grief advocate. She's just finishing up actually a new book called The Art of Grieving that she's written about how people can use the arts and art making to help us deal with grief more effectively so that grief doesn't have to be always thought of as a negative situation. How can we see the gift in grief is what her work is about. I went down a somewhat different path. I decided I needed to go through a therapeutic treatment program, and so I did that. I got some intense therapy around grief and loss, complicated grief it's called.
Hmm.
And something we talked about earlier, in 2010, got I was part of a reduction of force in my corporate work. So that got me kicked out of the corporate world. And of course, oh my God, what am I going to
Hmm.
do?
Right.
Help, Betsy, help, help. What am I going to do? But of course, it turned out to be the best thing in the world. I had friends of mine who said, oh, you should go into consulting and coaching. And I had already been kind of doing that in the corporate world. I had that experience. So then I embarked in 2010 on this new career, and it's been fantastic since. So even that was a resilience experience. So I began to see about that time that resilience is really a theme. It had become more popular after 9/11, after Hurricane Katrina, after Hurricane Sandy. Everybody was talking resilience. I'd like to point out that in 2005, your bank didn't have multiple redundant uh, call centers and service centers. They had one where they stored their data and everything was kept. Today, every big bank has dozens of them all around the world for redundancy, which is a resilience strategy. So we see resilience around, and that's when I started studying it. And then in 2016, along with my co-author, Alan Weiss, I wrote The Resilience Advantage that describes this model and how people can use and learn the skills of resilience to deal with their challenges more directly. And felt like I had good theoretical and practical skills in understanding and using resilience.
I think that there's like your story is so powerful, and I mean, hearing about your kids, like, just my heart breaks. And I'm looking forward to having Sheila on the show and talking about the art of grieving, because I think that that is something that we don't know how to do. Like when my dad passed, that was like the catalyst that got me to where I am today. But coming from a Jewish background, we have like rituals, like there were certain milestones and things like that. Like I think that in nowadays, like you're expected, like grief happens and you should be over it tomorrow. And I love like how you and Sheila, from an intentional standpoint, is sort of like, this grief is not going to instantly go away. We're going to companion with it, and then we're going to see what the lessons are within it. So I love that you guys just are that model. Like, talk about bounce forward for both of you. I mean, losing multiple kids is a tragedy. Um, And I like the idea, like even when you talk about the call center, it's like, okay, we could plan in advance, we have redundancies, we have ways to mitigate it. But there's this other side is like what happened with the kids, 9/11. These crises happen that you really could never even anticipate. And one of the things that I think is very difficult, like for business owners, who we're the face, we're the brand, we're everything, is it's hard for us to be out there, putting content out there, being on social media when there's all of this noise going on in our personal lives that's just as difficult. There's a lot of people right now, I understand it's a trend that, estrangement from children has become a trend since 2020. And that's a big thing. You have, health struggles, you have divorces, you have people in abusive relationship, but like you got a whole myriad of things, but you got to still kind of show up publicly,
Mhm.
and like how would you say the resilience advantage, could like how do you balance that? Like I got to be public, I got to be out there. Oh, and then social media makes it seem like everybody's, traveling the world and be super successful and look at us and everything's great. And it's like, oh, my life is not perfect. I can't become a thought leader until I got all my crap together. I can't write the book until my personal life has got no bumps and hiccups. How would speak to that person who might be wondering about this?
Sure. Well, I think, I think one of the things that social media has done, and I think there's been a tendency, is this notion of the hero on the white horse, that we have to do it all ourselves. You talked about the young woman earlier in your group who had the imposter syndrome. And how was that remedied? She got feedback from other people. So I think having, again, thinking about and using the community is a very powerful way of doing that. I think the second, I think one of the things to recognize, and you pointed this out, is that, we talked about 9/11. I talked about my family crises. We could talk about the financial crisis of 2008.
Hmm.
I believe it's going to take us a decade to recover from the pandemic. And I think most people don't want to talk. This is one of the things about grief that you'll hear Sheila talk about, is nobody wants to talk about it.
Yeah.
When you bring up issues in the workplace about post-pandemic, people go, "Oh, I don't want to talk about that anymore." Well, you probably need to talk about it because 40% of your buildings downtown are empty, and 60% of your staff don't want to come to work. And when you post something on social media, you're not getting, you're only getting 10 likes and not 100 likes. And you're only getting one comment instead of 40 comments. And so these things are all because everybody is so busy trying to avoid dealing with a certain reality of what's going on, that there's just too many, as you said, distractions. There's too many interesting things for people to do. See it in the arts. If you wanted to go to a performance of something in Denver tonight, there's probably 15 things you could do. Not to mention staying home and watching Oppenheimer on Netflix.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in
I'm on the Barbie side. I saw both movies. I'm on the Barbie side of the Barbie Oppenheimer thing. Well, go ahead. Sorry.
that's streaming for free, but Oppenheimer still costs. But the
Yeah, that's true.
Oscars are coming up, so you want to be share. Although probably when this, yeah, so you'll know the answer to that. So I think there's just, as you said, there's a lot of distractions, and I think what's important for consultants and coaches to be looking at is this first step around preparation. And the preparation is, asking questions and doing your strategic analysis of your work. Who are your customers? Who are you targeting? What are my success criteria? There's tons of ways of doing this. I attended a meeting one day, so a National Speakers Association meeting, and this guy gets up to speak, and as he's speaking, he takes off his coat. He's wearing a jacket. Takes off his jacket, takes off his tie. Um, he's wearing he's wearing a certain belt and shoes. Takes those off. He starts to change, and he transforms into an outdoorsman. So he's got one of these outdoor vests, and he puts on hiking boots, and he puts a waiter's outfit on. It turns out that he is a consultant to state gaming commissions around how they can better manage insects in certain gaming areas or small animals in certain. His niche is so small that there's nobody else who does what he does. And he's got 50 customers across the country, and that's all he focuses on. And what was so impressive about this guy, Betsy, was that he knew that question that we all are asked, and rarely can we identify with that kind of clarity, which is, who is your ideal customer?
Right. That's the number that talk about the girl I was struggling with that we were working on our ideal client. And that's when most people kind of have a hard time. Go
Yeah,
on with yeah.
yeah. And so, I think I did, and I have that problem. I shift my thinking about who my ideal client is. And I know I would be better if I had clarity around my ideal client being, a 50-year-old, this person in this role and doing that kind of work. That if I had that energy and focus around that person, that's who I would attract. So, I think there's plenty, and these are certainly questions you ask your clients in pushing them to think about the business aspect of their work. And I think for all of us to keep doing that and asking these questions and having the answers, writing them down and making a commitment and trying it out. If it
Yeah.
doesn't work, that's the thing about resilience is we learn from those experiences. And everyone agrees that if you don't have failures, you're not trying, you're not learning. So get out there, give it a whirl. And if it works, great. If it doesn't work, so be it.
There's a few things that I talk to people about when they first sign up to work with me. And I'm wondering if accidentally I was trying to build in resilience to the approach by doing the brand building. So the first things first is we get clear on their intentions, like what's your business supposed to create for your life, and get that in there first. And also get some time for reflection, like and make reflection and contemplation a part of your lifestyle, because that's the only way you're going to ever figure those things out. So it seems like thing one is getting clear on that. I think with the ideal client, why that builds resilience is it ignites the passion. And it's like when you're clear on who you serve, I talk about this with my clients all the time. Like when I love this quote from Audre Lorde, who says, like, when I dare to be powerful, when I use my strengths in service of my vision, it matters less and less whether I'm afraid. And when you're on point with a person, the person's what ignites the passion. It's not your mission, it's not your methodology. It's the person, like, oh, I really care about you. Like now I want to create more products and services for you because I care about you. And I think that there's something, about that. And then the third thing that I always talk to people about is like it's really important to brand your name because it's the most flexible container because you have no idea which way it's going to go. And success is not a straight line. It's more like an ice skater where you go side to side, and you put something out there, see how the market responds, and then you pivot, you keep pivoting. I mean, every year I change up my website because it's like, well, I don't know, because I'm never going to land, but I know I know who I want to help. I know why I want to help them, and I every time I learn something new, it's like I incorporate whatever it is that I learn. And I wonder if those are like some of those practices because you don't know where you want to go in a few years. Like you might have started in healthcare consulting, then moved to resilience consulting for organizations. My suspicion is that you're probably going to be working a lot more with individuals one-on-one again. I think you're going to go full circle, but it's going to be relative to maybe entrepreneurs and building some of that. Like there's going to be something, but you keep it and you don't know. You don't always know. And maybe that's what the resilient practices are, is like I got to build some passion in my life and I got to build some bandwidth we work for ourselves. And I would say that as consultants and coaches and business owners, we're the worst bosses in the world. We don't give ourselves time off. We don't take advantage of the fact that we work for ourselves.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I think, there's another element of the preparation phase, which I refer to as building hardiness. And hardiness is the reserve that we have in our storehouse. We can get that from working out. We can get that from eating well. We get that from taking vacations. We could get that from being around loved ones. And we get that from knowing who our work is focused on, having that passion and love. You talked about passion. Angela Duckworth has written about grit. And grit is a quality that she defines as passion and perseverance. So it's not enough to just persevere in it to be gritty. You also have to have that passion. That's what keeps you going. It's that storehouse that's inside you that builds that hardiness, that helps to build that hardiness so that you can keep going. Now, just to put the caveat out there, you can't, you can't overuse the grit. You can't really,
Hmm.
that's what happened around the pandemic. That's what burned people out. The first 3 or 4 months of the pandemic, productivity went up in companies. People were loving working at home. I'm going to work whatever I want to. I remember talking to a mother one day, and I said to her, how's it going with the family? She said, well, it's pretty good. The only challenge is the only time I really have to get my work done is between 10 and 2. I said, well, that's not too bad. Does your husband take care of the kids between 10 and 2? She said, no, they're asleep, 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. So, that level of grit began to wear on people, and that's why we saw so much pushback later as we got into the pandemic. And I think really why work from home took a nosedive in terms of the employers and also many employees who said, I want to get back to some kind of normalcy, and we're still trying to find that balance between us. So that's a bit of a caveat that we want to be aware of, is that even with resilience, it's important to me when I talk to corporate groups, I say to them, resilience is not intended to be something that says, okay, just keep going, suck it up, embrace the suck, keep going, you have resilience. There is a limit to how much we want to do. We really want to be happy in our work. And so we don't, if it gets to a point where people begin to get burnt out or begin to become depressed or begin to show some, emotional signs that things need some care tending, then managers need to be sensitive to that and make sure that they're helping their team members out.
But that seems to go back to the first thing that we talked about with the misconceptions about resilience. Resilience isn't sucking up and just dealing with difficult situations and just like, all right, fine, I'm going to endure this difficult situation. You said beginning is it's like the cycle of like learning how to like get back to stasis or, like adjusting. So let's say you are home, like, you adjust. That doesn't mean you have to work extra hard. Like if somebody's like working more than they were before, then it's like, I would probably say, well, I wonder if you're worried that you're going to be on the chopping block. So you're worried about your productivity. So it's not really true resilience. Like the true resilience would be is, all right, this is stressful. How do I work through my stress? And then how do I use this as an opportunity to reinvent myself? Or maybe this makes me think that what I'm living isn't exactly what I want or the career that I don't want. But I think that people are I think it goes back to what we said in the beginning. Like that's a misconception. That is not resilience. That's denial. And that is almost like our fight or flight. I'll dig in because I'm afraid of something bad happening. It's not coming out of like our conscious self. It's coming out of our
Emotional.
survival stuff.
It's coming from the amygdala, not from the prefrontal cortex.
Yes, yes.
And we have to honor that. So you don't, for as a consultant, if you're working with a client and they do have that kind of panic, you want to make sure that you honor that by saying, hey, I appreciate that this is scary. Let's go back to what the strengths are. Let's talk about what the opportunity is. What's the risk factors? Returning to a more logical and rational way of thinking is where we want to do, and we want to honor, the emotional reality that's going on for that person, because the feelings are real. They don't have to stay that way, and we want to just make sure that we don't toss them out.
So I want to get to like you said that you have some, silver bullets and some practices that people can employ. And I want to end with that because that feels actionable, but I just want to address one quick thing before we get there. And that is around like, could you talk a little bit though about the shame? We talked a little bit about the practices, but the shame that somebody might feel where, because I don't know if I fully heard the answer to the question on that one is, I got a public business, my face is out there, but I got like a shit show going on in I wonder if I'm not allowed to say shit show. I'll have to see if my podcast team might delete that out or maybe it stays in there, but it's like a crap show in my personal life, where I don't have all my crap together, but I still got to have a public. Can you address that shame so that those things don't become this debilitating thing and you can be resilient even though everything in your life isn't 1,000% buttoned up and looking what you think everybody else's life is looking like?
Sure. So I'm a clinician as well as a business psychologist. So when somebody starts talking about difficulty in their life, I first want to make sure that it hasn't reached some clinical level to where they are not, realistically able. You wouldn't ask somebody to drive a car if they had two broken arms. So I want to make sure that I'm screening for that. And there's a difference between feeling bad and having some, episode of negative thinking or, questioning your capability. And the general, rule of thumb for this, is that if it's something that's lasting for 2 weeks or more consecutively, then you worry about it. If it's something that happens for 2 or 3 days and then you bounce forward or even just bounce back in that situation, that's fine. I like to use the criteria of frequency and intensity. So how often does that happen and how intense is it on a scale of 0 to 10? So let's assume that it's a crap show and not a shit show. Just to kind of we'll distinguish those two between each other. I think that how do you remedy when you're feeling bad about yourself? What's your particular strategy for it? So for me, and that happens for me, every couple of weeks I have. Yesterday was one of those days I just couldn't get anything done. I didn't have any focus. I went for a walk. I laid down, took a little nap. I worked from home. I could do that. I just, at the end of the day, I didn't really feel very, very good about myself. So I decided when I went to sleep that I was going to go work out first thing in the morning. So I decided I would make a change that I just needed, even if I didn't have the energy for it, I would go ahead and take some initiative for doing that. Now, I have a good deal of initiative, so I know I can kind of prompt myself to do that. But if I woke up feeling like I'm just going to lay in bed all day, then I might be a little concerned about that. I mean, listen, I'm a psychologist. I'm not embarrassed at all to say I talked about therapy earlier. I've used therapy my whole life. I love it. In fact, my therapist just retired recently. Darn her.
Oh man, she was supposed to be available to you forever.
She was great. I loved working with her, and she made such a difference in my life.
How dare her have boundaries and personal goals?
Yeah, and I need it. So, but it may also be, and I certainly do this for my clients, it may be an executive coach. It may be Betsy Jordyn. These things are too hard to deal with on our own. You can't necessarily, if you're feeling bad, you're not going to call Betsy up. She's not going to be your therapist in that situation. So you have to rely on other people. It's a friend, it's a family member, maybe it's a mastermind group of peers who, particularly if it's a business issue, you reach out. So I think, if there's a personal issue going on, you want to, again, I use the term honor that. You want to recognize that it's happening. You don't want to linger there. So I like to say that, pain is understanding, sufferable is unnecessary.
Yeah.
So suffer through a situation. If you're having a bad day, go do something different. Go do something you enjoy. Go see a movie. Work on your hobby. Whatever it may be that helps transform you out of that mood. If it lasts 3 or 4 days, get some help from some other people because that's not normal. I think the other issue about how do we deal with getting the branding and messaging out, that's how do I do that? How do I recommend clients do that? I think you have to find a pattern for doing that. My rule of thumb is I post 2 times a week on LinkedIn. That's my primary social media access. And once I put something out, I write a weekly blog called Resilient Wednesday on Wednesdays. And I was just noticing it the other day, Betsy. I've written 497 of them.
Wow.
Every 497 weeks. So I'm pretty proud of that, coming up on 500. And so I have, a rule of thumb that I put these things out. I've got a mailing list of 3,000 people or whatever it is. It goes to another 15,000. Once it's out there, it's out there. I post things on LinkedIn. Some of them are reposts of something someone said or an article that I read that I want to provoke someone's thinking. And I'm exploring and playing around with that. I've put a lot of things out there about, I try to be a little provocative. So, when all the word was going around about quiet quitting, I said it's not quiet quitting, it's loud screaming. People are unhappy and they're screaming about this. I got, a lot of people were interested in that topic. But you're not, it's about getting your work out, your intellectual property. And
Even
also,
if, even if, even if
even if,
everything's not okay. Like one of my clients right now is like, she's been going gangbusters, but she had a major issue with her son that happened this week. It's been distracting for sure. And it's not going to be something that's going to be resolved in a week or 2 or 3 weeks. She's on a new journey with this
yeah,
scenario, but it doesn't disqualify her from all the other things that she wants to do. And I think that would be the resilience message I would hope people would come across is just because everything is not perfect and some things are not going to be buttoned up, it doesn't disqualify you. Your mission is your mission. It's still going to be there. And then somewhere in it, in your circumstances, you had a mission, you had this other mission, but then the suffering really just sweetened and deepened the mission you already had. So it's like you're not really like this separate person, and these things happening to you will serve you at some point. But I think going along with it is like, let's just kind of companion with it. You
yeah.
mentioned the workout thing.
Well,
Well,
I just
oh,
want to
sorry,
go
go
back
ahead.
a second because I want to go back to something you said earlier, which is, depending on what her work is, she may want to take some time to write about that,
Yeah.
write a blog on her website or write a post on LinkedIn. I tell a lot of stories about myself. I've shared, something very, very deeply personal with you as I do with other people. Authenticity is a powerful force today. There's nothing more powerful. People want to know you're a human being and that you have the same struggles they do. And if she has a challenge with her son, assuming it's something that she can share in some way that's appropriate, it may be something that will help her and help her clients because they may
Yes.
go through the same thing. So that's that opportunity you were talking about earlier.
And that's a good point too, is like reminder that I'm not the only person who's going through stuff. I show up with my humanity and I don't have everything together, so I could tell you, and now we're going to be connected. Um, as we are moving towards the end of this interview, we've talked about so many different things. I want to make sure everybody's listening knows how to get a hold of you and your books. And I want to end on here's that silver bullet we promised of the kind of practices that you can implement, at least, or that silver bullet that you mentioned. So, can you first share about you and how people can find you and that silver bullet of the practice, or if the silver bullet has got several practices within it, please share that as well.
Well, people can get more information at my new website, which is richardcitrin.com. That's Citrin, and talk about myself and the services. Got some cute pictures on there and talk about the
Hold on.
book.
Can you do that again? Because my note taker just popped back and I don't want the video to be ruined. Can you just say it again? You can find starting from you can find me. Nathan, we need to cut this part out. Go ahead.
Thanks, Betsy. Yes, people can find me at my new website, which is richardcitrin.com. That's Citrin.com, Richard Citrin. And on there, you'll see information about me, about my services, about what we're doing. Look at my blogs. Also have a whole page of resilience resources that I've developed over the past 10 years that are available and free for people to use. Also have links to my two books. I've written three, but one of them's out of print. The first book, of course, is The Resilience Advantage, which is right over here. And Strategy, let me get these. Both of these are available on Amazon, of course. This is The Resilience Advantage. I wrote that with Alan Weiss. And this is my book on leadership development called Strategy Driven Leadership that I wrote with Michael Couch. And that's the best way. And then if people want to connect with me, of course, I'd love to. There's so many strategies around resilience, and I like to break the strategies down around this planning, navigation, and bounce forward. So let me talk about those. And within there is the silver bullet, particularly around the planning and the bounce forward, which is that the silver bullet is really around how we think. It's the
Mm.
thinking part. That's why when I talked earlier about the positivity, the negativity bias is so powerful in our lives that the more we can think about what's possible, what are the success factors, what do we want life to be, what's that ideal client, our thinking and how we change our thinking around so that we see more of the positive and what's more possible is really the key to building a resilient model. That happens on the planning side because on the planning side, we want to think about what our ideal situation is, but we also want to manage the risk. So we want to think about what the possible downside is. That kind of pre-planning and thinking, how we think, really sets the stage for not only success, but also for mitigating or decreasing the risk of stressful situations. The navigation in real time, really the only key for that is around developing a practice of mindfulness. I do a lot of work with clients around mindfulness. I really try to demystify mindfulness. It's thought of course, as kind of a Buddhist or Eastern tradition, which is where I think it became popularized in the United States. But the truth is, and I like to take any kind of spirituality or religion out of it, and recognize that mindfulness is really a birthright of ours. We all have that
Mm-hmm.
capacity to quiet our mind. We do it when we go on your hikes that you're going to be doing in the Rocky Mountains. We do it when we enjoy playing with our dog. We do it when we enjoy and savor the taste of a delicious coho salmon at the beginning of salmon season. Wherever we can savor life, that's being mindful. And we can develop an intentional practice around mindfulness with meditation practices, with quiet walking, with all kinds of different tools and traits. But we don't need the bells and whistles and bongs and, well, probably not the bongs. You're in Colorado, but probably not the bongs. But
Are you talking
without
about
the
the
bells,
gongs? The
no,
bongs? Oh no, the bongs are in Colorado.
I'm
Are you
sorry.
talking about the gong
Yeah,
therapy? Or are you talking about the bong
yeah, you're
therapy?
right. I'm talking about the gongs, not the bongs.
Okay, because we could easily be mindful with our with our edibles here, but go on.
Exactly, exactly. And then the bounce forward again is that kind of mindful thinking. How do we take this situation and learn from it? In that instance, learning. Learning. I'm a big believer, as I've talked about, in terms of strengths and understanding our strengths. And my number one strength is learner. I
Mm.
love learning. And if you're not a learner, it's very hard to grow and change. And so developing some expertise in that is an important way of doing that. I was working with somebody who said, I don't like to read. I'm not really a learner at all. And I said, well, what do you enjoy reading? He says, I'm not really, maybe sports books. So I told him to start reading some sports books, and he's immediately been able to transform a lot of his work, not necessarily into sports metaphors, but to understand in his own way how he can apply the challenges he has to what he sees great athletes do. And I think that's a wonderful role model for helping us see what success is like. Talk about positivity. You hit baseball's coming up, you hit a base hit, and everybody goes ecstatic on the team. Forget about the fans. So baseball and football and athletes are very good at celebrating every little bit of success. And
And
we can
talk about mindfulness. Like they're very much in the moment. Like you cannot be a good athlete without being in the moment. And I think that that's what you're talking about is I think it goes with that companioning thing. When you're talking about the mindfulness is like I'm going to be in the observer role and I'm not going to get like totally whipped up by what's happening around me.
exactly. We see that all the time. If you got kids or grandkids, you see them playing in a schoolyard or playing in a playground. You just enjoy watching them, you savoring that moment. That's mindfulness.
That's awesome. So really at the end of the day, there's a million practices you could choose, but they're all within the planning, the navigating together with, and then the bouncing forward. They're all there, but the silver bullet is like making an intentional choice to say, I want to choose to stay in almost like this coherent state, where I'm like my prefrontal cortex is like totally activated and keep myself out of that fight or flight. And if I can do that and I can create practices in my life from a planning standpoint and during and while I'm competing it with it, then whatever the possibilities are, they're going to emerge for me. That's going to allow me to bounce forward.
You got it. You're going to get your certificate in the resilience advantage later this afternoon.
Yay, I want to see my badge. I want to get my, Richard badge that I am a resilient, I'm a resilient AF person. So that would be great.
You get
Well,
it.
thank you so very, very much for being on the show. This has just been so illuminating for me. And it makes me realize like I didn't realize like a lot of what I do as a business mentor is really cultivating that resilience. Like, yeah, you too can repackage your career and turn it into a business. And this could be the best thing that happened to you. Losing your job, burnout, all of the things that are there, what you think crippled you qualifies you for this future. And that's what my passion is. And I didn't realize like maybe that was a thematic thing I had underneath it. So now I'm a little bit more aware. So if you are interested in learning more about resilience practices, highly recommend everything that Richard was talking about. If you want to work on your ideal client, figure out how to build your business and your, brand messages, definitely reach out to me. You can go to my website at www.betsydordan.com. When you get on my website, if you want to talk to me, you can book a free strategic clarity coaching call with me and we could talk about how we could partner together. So, thank you all for listening. Don't forget to hit subscribe wherever you're listening, and I will see you all next time.
Thanks, Betsy.
Thank you.